Come on back. I love all the chitter-chatter. It's so great. If we haven't met yet, my name is Jackie Giardino, and I'm the Director of Women's Ministry here, which means I get to hang out with you all and pray for you all day, every day, and it's just the best. But today we're going to talk about Esther. And before we begin, at the risk of being superficial, or you all thinking I'm superficial, I'm going to talk about hair for a minute. If you were here in the fall, I talked about clothes. I'm sorry. It's just part of who I am. So I would presume at some point in your life you have had your hair cut by somebody else. Would you agree? Okay. If you've only ever cut your hair, I want to talk to you afterwards because that's just impressive. But I would think that at some point you've had your hair cut by somebody else. Now, have you ever thought about the roles that you play when you get your hair cut by somebody else? You show up and you sit down. I would think you would sit down. And you're like, okay, this is what I would want. This is my dream of my perfect haircut. Or maybe you're super risky and you go, do whatever you want. And then the hairdresser, or maybe, there's probably a better, the stylist, the PC word for it, cuts your hair, and you hope she does what you want, but sometimes she does something totally different, and sometimes that's what you want, you didn't know it, and sometimes it's different. And so there's these roles that we play. Now, there's the role of the friend as well. The person that you beforehand say, I'm thinking about doing this, like I'm just going to go blue. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's a super great idea, or I don't think that goes well. Well, I have a friend who, when I was 9 months pregnant with my third, so if you have heard that babies get bigger as you have babies, the moms do too. And so I was 9 months pregnant, and I had it in my head that I was going to cut my hair as a pixie cut, like super short pixie cut. And so I said to my friend, I'm like, oh, this is what I want to do. It's going to be no fuss. It's going to be so easy. I'm going to have 3 little boys, pixie cut. I got my hair cut as a pixie cut, and I don't ask her advice anymore because it was awful. And her role as a friend was to tell me what was going to happen, right? Like, this is not a wise choice. Your face is just going to look rounder. But we all have roles we play. So there's the hairdresser, there's me in the chair, and there's the friend. And as we look at Esther, we're going to see these different roles that we play. There's somebody who is saying, like, I think this is what I want to have happen, but God, I'm going to trust you. There's somebody who's saying, that's God who's saying, I've got you. Like, I know what's going to happen. And then there's the friend speaking in some advice and speaking in some thoughts. So keep that in mind. And the thing is, when we look at this, we see that God knows his role. And the question I have for you today is, do you know yours? So before we jump in too much into specifics of Esther, we're going to look at where it fits within the whole Bible. Because, as I always say, this is Bible study, and it's in the name. So we're going to study the Bible. So let's start with this fantastic timeline that we've been working on. If you're on this side of the room, it's the same here as it is up here. I'm just going to point. We're going to start back with this guy with his long beard, and he represents Abraham. So if you have your timeline, you can pull it out. Now, we're going to be talking about God's people, and through the Bible and through talks, they kind of have a few different names. They often get referred to as the Israelites, or the Hebrews, or the Jews, and that's depending on the different contexts. For the sake of today, I will probably refer to them as the Jews, but it's all the same people. So back here, with the guy with the beard, with Abraham, God makes a promise to his people. He actually makes 4 promises to Abraham about his people. Because God knows his role. He's like, I'm going to take care of you. He promised his people that they would be the promised people. They would have salvation through Jesus, who was going to come thousands of years later, and we'll get to that. They were going to have a land that was theirs, that was going to be flowing with milk and honey and be this amazing place. But they had a job. They had to clear it out of all the people who weren't following God. And they were going to be a great nation of many, many people, more than the stars that you could count in the sky. And they would receive a blessing from God. So all of this happens back with Abraham. God gives Abraham this promise. And so going on, the people of God have to continue forward, and they're supposed to follow what God wants them to do. But the thing is, they don't. And neither do we. Right? God has his role, and it's our role, it's our job to seek what he wants and to obey him. But so often we do our own thing, and there are consequences for that, and there were consequences for God's people as well. And so because of that, if you go to the next one, Amber, we're going along, and this is God's people, and there's consequences. They are in their promised land that they've been promised, but they're not following him, and so the kingdom splits. And Carolyn talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that you get the divided kingdom. And so from that, it's no longer God's people altogether. And so then these invasions come. That is more consequence for them doing what they want to do, not what God wanted for them. So if you look at this map, you're going to see, okay, so Jerusalem is kind of the chosen place down here. Can you see it up there? I circled it for you. Okay. There's the Assyrians, which is this huge group that's going to come down from here, and they're going to kind of try to come down and try to take over Jerusalem, but they get stopped because the people in Jerusalem are like, okay, we're going to start following God because we're freaking out. And then later on, the Babylonians come down, and they take over Jerusalem, and then they cart some people back to Babylon. Okay, so the God's people are split up all over the place. And so some of them are in Jerusalem, most of them have been carted back to Babylon. And then from here, this is where they're hanging out. And then the Persians come in, and they take over everywhere. They are this huge kingdom. And so everything that you see that's in color on here is taken over by the Persian Empire. And so the Persian Empire, they were gracious to Jews, and they were like, okay, you can go home if you want. And so some people went back to Jerusalem, and that's when we talked about in Nehemiah. And some of them stayed there, because sometimes it's easier just to stay in this place that you know than it is to go back and go, okay, I'm going to try something new, knowing that that's the better thing, even if it feels unsafe. And so some of the Jews in Babylon actually go further east to Susa, which is over here. Now, Susa is the capital city of the Persian Empire. Think of it like Hunger Games, like this is the place to be. And so there's a bunch of Jews who are living there, and they are like trying to fit in, and the Persian Empire's goal is for them to fit in, and so they're hanging out. And so there becomes this tension of these Jews who are living in Susa of, are they going to live as the Persian Empire wants them to, or are they going to live according to the way God wants them to? And that's where we pick up in Esther. So let's start with the beginning of Esther, and then we'll get to chapter 4, which you guys studied in your study this week. Okay, so there's a king in the beginning of Esther. Because there's a bunch of people, I've got some cartoon characters. Not because I think you're little kids, but just to keep it all straight. Okay, this is King Ahasuerus. So like he has a hard name to pronounce, okay? We're going to call him king, but he was most likely Xerxes. If you've ever heard of Xerxes, he's a historical king. And so because of knowing that he's Xerxes, we can know a lot more details about Esther. It's so cool. When we look at the Bible, we see how clearly it fits in with history, and it ties in together. And it just opens it up for us to know, like, these are things that really happened. Okay, so Xerxes, or the king, he has this huge feast before he leaves for war. So this is Esther chapter 1. So he's having this 6-month-long feast. I mean, it is so ridiculously extravagant, you cannot even fathom. And part of that feast would be him probably touring his kingdom and kind of seeing like, oh, look at how wonderful everything is, and everybody love on me, and then he goes off to war. And so he goes to Greece, and he fights over there. Well, during that time, he is when Esther's getting prepared. So if you read in the study, do you remember Esther had a chunk of time that she was preparing to meet the king, and so that's when he's off at war. So she's preparing and getting all ready. Okay, he gets defeated in Greece. Wah, wah. He's not happy about that. And he comes back about 479 BC. So he comes back to his people, and then he chooses Esther in the process. So now Esther and the king are married. Okay? I know, isn't she pretty? Okay, Esther had been living with her cousin Mordecai because her parents had died and he had taken her in. And so now she's married to the king. Now watch this. She is married to a foreigner. And early in the Bible, God clearly says, don't get married to a foreigner. It's only going to make your life harder. And I know that some of us are married to people who aren't following God. And it's not necessarily going to be an easy road. But the thing is that God is going to use Esther in a mighty, mighty way. And the same with you in your marriage. So even if it's not God's best, God's not going to be stopped by that. He can use it. And it's so exciting to see what he does when we continue to turn to him. And maybe it's some other choice in your life that you're like, oh, I probably shouldn't have made that choice. But he can still use it because God knows his role, and we need to know ours. Okay, so the queen and the king are married, and the king has a friend, Haman. Okay, and Haman and Mordecai have issues with each other. And this is where we get to in chapter 4. So there's some history here, which is why we went all the way back to Abraham. Okay, so Mordecai will not bow down to Haman. And so Haman decides, I'm going to wipe out your whole people. Seems a little harsh, right? It's like maybe Mordecai should have just bowed down because there's history. So Haman is a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite. Okay, so follow me on this. Agag is a guy, and he's part of the tribe of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the first people to attack the Jews, the Israelites, the Hebrews, when they left Egypt. So they're wandering through the desert, trying to get to the promised land, and the Amalekites attack them. God's like, those are my people, and he promises he's going to wipe them out. Okay? So there's a little tension there, because they know that Haman's like, your God can wipe me out. But, continues on, Mordecai is part of King Saul's family, and King Saul was going through the promised land and was supposed to be wiping all the people out, and he said, Haman's descendants, I'm not going to wipe you out. You have really good animals, and I kind of like you. I'm going to let you live. And so he's going to now suffer the consequences from that. His job was to his family's job was to wipe out his family. Okay? That's what God told him to do. He didn't do that. Are you following me? Okay, so there's consequences for that when we don't do what God wants us to do. Okay, so because of that, Haman's descendants have family, and now they're all mad at Mordecai's family and said, you're not going to bow down to me, I'm going to wipe you out. Okay, so Haman decides that it's time for Mordecai and all of the Jewish people to be gone. So he decides to roll some dice to decide what day to do it. How? It just blows my mind. It doesn't blow your mind? Who's rolling dice to decide when we're going to kill everybody? But that's what Haman does, because he's a bad guy. Okay, Mordecai hears about the dice rolling, and freaks out and starts crying at the city gate. See, he's tearing his clothes. He's like, all my people are going to die. I'm freaking out. And he's now at the city gate, outside the king's palace, freaking out. And then we pick up with Esther. So Esther is inside the palace. Mordecai is outside the palace, freaking out. And then they have the little exchange, okay? So Esther is like, Mordecai, you're embarrassing me. And sends him some clothes to be like, get it together, put on some clothes, because he's ripped all his clothes and is having a big mess. And Mordecai responds and says, nope. And then Esther responds and says, well, why? Why are you freaking out? And remember, all this is happening through Hathach, her servant. So there's a go-between between the two of them. They don't actually get to talk. And Mordecai says, well, there's this thing. Haman is going to kill all the people. You need to do something. And he's like, you need to do something. Go talk to the king. And Esther says, I can't go talk to the king. He's going to kill me. And then we get Mordecai's reply in verse 14. So listen to this. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to kingdom for such a time as this. Some people think that Mordecai is actually threatening Esther here, but he's just saying, God's going to do it. He's going to take care of his people because he always does what he says he will. Because God knows his role. Esther, do you know your role? Are you going to be the one that steps up? Are you going to be the one that's going to be a part of what God is doing? Because it's going to be awesome. Because God's going to do it, whether you get to be a part of it or not. The thing about Esther is it's the only book in the Bible where God isn't named. You never see the word God. You never see Jesus in there. But he is so clearly working. And the thing is, the author of Esther was so intentional in that. Because we look at all the other literature from that time, and they're all talking about some form of religion or God or something. There's nothing about that here. And sometimes in our lives, it looks like God isn't working, but he so clearly is. And we get to be a part of it when we say, we're going to be the one. We're going to know our role. You see, the Jews thought that they had been abandoned because they were living in this exile. They were like, God doesn't love us anymore. We're miserable. Mordecai's tearing his clothes. But there are no coincidences. God had put Esther in this role. And I wonder what role he's put you in, that he's going to use you in a mighty way. So, my question for you is, 1, do you know who you are? Do you know who you are? That you have been loved by a mighty God, that you walk with him, that he is with you and strong for you. Esther knew who she was. She was having a bit of an identity crisis because she had 2 names. She's the only person in this book that has 2 names. And she's trying to figure out, am I going to be Persian and assimilate with all of them and just keep my mouth quiet? Or am I going to be Esther and stand up and do what God wants me to do? And we have that too, don't we? The Persian Empire was assimilation. They wanted everybody to look the same, everybody to look Persian. And the world around us makes the same way. It wants us to look like them. But how different it is when we look like the way Jesus wants us to look. When we look at his word and what it says, that we are kind instead of spiteful. We are loving instead of anger. When we live in a way that's different. So I ask you, if you're not living for Jesus, what are you living for? What choices are you making instead of him? And is it satisfying? You have been uniquely placed in the position you're in. Think about it. You could have been born in any other time in history, in any other part of the world, with any other family. But God put you here to be the mom to the kids you are, to be the coworker to those you are, to be the neighbor, or to have the interaction with the gal at the grocery store. For such a time as this. And sometimes I feel like that's intimidating to go, okay, God, like you have this great big plan for me, but I don't know it, and I'm sure not equipped for it. But I love the phrase that says, broken crayons can still color, right? We can be broken and messed up, but we can still make a beautiful picture. And we have confidence because of who's behind us. Look at this image. If this was you and you're like, ooh, I've got the little doe eyes and I'm feeling freaked out. But God is behind you as a mighty lion, giving you confidence, giving you words, giving you encouragement. Esther knew that God would help her. And her response to Mordecai's challenge is to ask for help from God. She asked all the Jews to fast, all the Jews to pray for her. She's like, I'm going to need some help if I'm going to do this. She knew she couldn't do it alone, and neither can we. So you've been placed where you are for a purpose, and are you living out that purpose? So 2, know your purpose. Who you are defines your purpose. But there's the flip of that as well. Your purpose, what you live for, what you're pursuing, defines who you are. Esther's actions flooded from knowing her purpose. And you know your story. You know all the pieces that are in you, all the things in the depths of you that we don't know and we can't see. But God has worked already in your life. How has he made you? What is he yet to do? You have been made for such a time as this. In a nutshell, Esther wins a beauty contest and then uses her position as the queen to save the Jews from an evil plot against them. Sounds like a little fairy tale, doesn't it? But the same is true for our relationship with Jesus, is that he's put you in this beautiful time with such a purpose for you to live your own fairy tale, even with the evil guys and the craziness going on for such a time as this. The book of Esther isn't meant to show us how to behave in morally ambiguous situations. It shows us how God behaves in spite of them. Because sometimes when we're getting a haircut, it gets a little messy before it looks cute. You know, it's all up on your hair and wet and just kind of gross, or they blow dry it and it's sticking out like this. But it's part of the process to be able to create this beautiful thing that God is doing. And we have those same defining moments where we get to decide what we're going to do with the gospel of Jesus. The great Professor Dumbledore in the second Harry Potter movie says, "It is not our abilities that show us what we truly are, it's our choices." I want to tell you a story about a family I know from Many years ago, I was working in student ministry, and it was the day before Thanksgiving, and I was putting up my Christmas lights. I'm sorry if that offends some of you, that it was before Thanksgiving, but it was not a blizzard in Chicago, so we were putting up Christmas lights. And I got this call from this mom, and she was freaking out on the phone. And she was telling me that they were on the way to the ER with her husband, and they had 4 kids. And her husband had been having some bad headaches and some weird, flashing light stuff. And then he had a seizure, and they were going in. And she's like, "You need to help me." And I'm sitting there, and I'm still in my master's. I had not taken my, how to pray and care for people class yet. And was freaking out. I'm like, I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to care for you. But I knew who I was. I knew that God was with me. And I knew that I was there for such a time as this. And so over the next week, I walked with that family and those kids. And I remember sitting on the stairwell with them, asking God, give me words to say and verses to show them and pray with them, and just walk with them in that, having no idea what I was doing, but at the same time knowing that God knew. He knew his role, and I just had to be obedient and say yes to mine and say, I'm going to show up for you even if I put my foot in my mouth. And through that process, the dad ended up having a craniotomy, and there was the whole thing. And somehow, I was the one that ended up having to tell their kids that the dad was fine after the surgery and had this sweet moment with them. But after it all, I remember thinking, well, what if the dad wasn't fine? What would I have said in that moment? And I could have called for other pastors on staff or asked for help, but God had put me in that moment for a reason, to grow my faith, to be able to minister to them. So every year on the anniversary, they send me a note, and they go, remember when you showed up and you had no idea what you were doing? I'm like, yeah, I still don't, but God does. And so it's just sweet. We get to choose to be part of what he's doing. So I want you to watch for opportunities around you. That conversation with the grocery store gal, the neighbor, the friend, the coworker, your kids or your mom. Esther wasn't expecting to be put in a place like this. And neither were we. But God knows his role. When we know ours, we can walk forward in faith. The thing is, gals, God's not done with you yet. Because if he was, you would be home. You would be in heaven. But you're here with a purpose, a beautiful purpose that he has. And the thing is, we can know that knowing what God's done for us. That Jesus died and resurrected, that we could have a relationship with him for forever. And we remember what he did, it gives us power for what we are going to do. So we're going to take a few minutes and celebrate communion together. Now, for those of you who are freaking out about 1 cup on the table, I'm just going to talk logistics for a second, and then we're going to process through it together. We're going to pass and break off and dip. Do not drink, okay? But if even that part of passing makes you uncomfortable, pull your hand sanitizer out of your purse if you want to, or there's some on the door on the way out, or feel free to just pass and let it go by. But I'm going to pick this up. The thing is, on the night before Jesus was killed for us, he gathered his disciples together, and they shared a meal together. And in that time, he said, remember what I'm doing for you, that it is my body poured out for you, my body broken for you, sorry. It is my blood poured out for you. And then do this in remembrance of me. Let us remember what God has done and how that changes us going forward. So go ahead and pass the elements. Go ahead and dip and take as you feel fit. Oh, thank you. Bonnie just reminded me the bread is gluten-free. So if that's a trouble, she watched me eat it. and it's grape juice. Allergens are in the closet if you need to see them. But go ahead and partake when you're ready. Remember what God has done for you. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for breaking your body for us, for pouring out your blood for us, for taking all of our sins, all of our choices, all of our consequences. So we can have a relationship forever with you, being empowered by you to be part of the kingdom that you are building on this earth. God, thank you that we get to be a part of it, that you invite us in for such a time as this. God, give us the strength to say yes to it. Yes to those opportunities that we see. Yes to those conversations that are hard. To be part of what you are doing. We can see you working. We can trust you more because of it. We love you, sweet Jesus. Amen. You see, Esther went on and she stood up to the king. And if you read the rest of Esther, it's kind of a wild story. And I would encourage you to do that maybe over midwinter break. But God didn't allow his people to be wiped out because he is faithful. He made promises and he will always keep them because he knows his role. The question is, do we get to be a part of it, of what he's doing? Do we know ours? So I want to leave you with this. Hebrews 4:16 says, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." God's going to give it to us. We need to lean into what he's doing. Okay. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.